The Callisto Protocol. A game that has managed to generate an incredible amount of hype and excitement even before its release, which was most likely connected to its obvious similarities with the critically acclaimed Dead Space series. Unfortunately, this exact likeness set a pretty high expectation for the game to meet, which, as you certainly know, it failed to meet in basically every aspect besides graphics. And though many critics already labeled the game as underwhelming, lackluster, and generally pretty disappointing, we are here today to give it one more chance and will shine light on a totally different aspect of it. What we will be looking at is if the Callisto Protocol, and more specifically its achievements and trophies, are worth completing. To do so, we will look at three defining elements. First, the overall difficulty you'll be confronted with if you want to fully complete the game. Then, the time, or rather the grind you have to be willing to put yourself through in order to unlock all of the achievements. And lastly, we will also consider if the journey to full completion for this game is at all fun and enjoyable, or if the game is a pure and mindless chore to complete. So, with all of that said, let's take a thorough look at the Callisto Protocol through the lens of a completionist, and find out just how well the game does when it comes to trophies, achievements, and completion. Let's jump right in. We are starting off with what I personally found the most irritating thing about the Callisto Protocol. Its difficulty. There is a bit of an elephant in the room that I want to address right away, because if you are into achievement or trophy hunting at all, and have looked at the Callisto Protocol with the intent of completing it one day, I am sure that you're aware that there's an exploit you can use to get the Protocol is about life trophy, even without beating the game on the maximum security difficulty. And just in case you don't know, you can basically play through the entire game on easy and only change to the hardest difficulty once you've beaten the last boss. And due to the glitch, it will still earn you the achievement that's connected to the hardest difficulty. Now, many people who take achievement or trophy hunting seriously frown upon those who abuse glitches like these, as it seems like a cheap and dirty way to deal with difficulty spikes and skill requiring tasks, while still earning you the same reward as those who have completed the challenge in a legitimate way. An example that came to my mind immediately when I heard of this glitch was Hollow Knight, where you could turn yourself invincible with a glitch and just breeze through the final few bosses that would normally be mind-bogglingly difficult. And to be honest with you, I get why people get frustrated or annoyed with those who take advantage of glitches like these, because while they do put in the time and effort to legitimately earn an achievement that should be reserved for people like them, someone else can obtain the same thing by using an exploit or a glitch and will not only get the same achievement as stated as an undeserved reward, but on top of that will also raise the completion rate for that respective achievement, making it seem like a much more common thing to achieve than it actually is. What is much more important than what people may or may not think about you cheesing your way through a normally very difficult process, or the fact that you make a desired trophy or achievement somewhat less rare, is the fact that you are robbing yourself of both the experience and the pleasure that comes with overcoming certain challenges that are locked behind either entire difficulty settings or specific parts of the game. But to end this whole rant and finally get back to the Callisto Protocol, let me just say this. While I can totally stand behind the idea that you don't cheese difficult challenges in most video games for the reason of not spoiling that sweet feeling of success for yourself, there is sadly just nothing to be gained at all from taking the honest approach and beating the game's actual hardest difficulty when it comes to the Callisto Protocol. So I honestly, and without even trying to be cynical, advise you to play through the game on easy and then use the exploit to get the hardest difficulty done and stack the trophies that are connected to it in one go. But let me explain you why that is. The Callisto Protocol has three difficulties. What differentiates them is the amount of health your enemies have, how much damage they deal if they land a hit on you, and how much loot you are handed to deal with the hardships you will encounter. And while that sounds very standard on paper and doesn't really give too much away on what you actually need to expect, the reality is that the only thing you will truly notice is that the enemies are tanky and that they hit pretty hard, which is fair and makes sense, considering that you're playing on the hardest difficulty. What does not make any sense, however, is the fact that even on the hardest difficulty, resources are abundant. So much so that you will end up in situations where your inventory is so stuffed with ammunition, health kits and valuable treasures that you will have to do one of two things. Option 1 is backtracking to the nearest shop where you can exchange those goods for credits, which is admittedly a bit annoying but still way better than option 2, which is that you simply discard or leave these items behind. And while it can be argued that inventory management is as much a part of the typical survival horror experience as overwhelming numbers of enemies and odds that aren't in your favor, the latter two things are just not the case in the Callisto Protocol. Enemies specifically are the number one issue I have with this game, because whenever you knock the lights out of one of the mutated beasts that jump at you, they are guaranteed to drop loot, which can be health, ammunition or credits, which in turn further adds to the problem that you're being flooded with resources from every side. It is not uncommon at all that you enter a fight in critical condition and end up leaving with more health than you started with, due to the guaranteed drops from corpses. The reason why it is possible to pull this off rather easily is due to the nature of the enemies, which are just so incredibly stupid that it's almost comical at times. You see, as soon as you're first confronted with an enemy, the game explains you the combat mechanics, and it becomes very apparent that all you need to do to reliably beat your enemies is using the dodge feature, which you trigger by pushing the thumbstick to the left or right respectively so that you can evade incoming attacks. I've heard that many people have issues with the dodge mechanic and don't like it, but I personally found it extremely useful and didn't really run into any problem with it during the entire game. Not only is dodging the best way to completely avoid any damage, you can actually reliably pull it off, because there's basically no cooldown to it and the game is very forgiving with the reaction window it gives you to pull the stunt off. Next to dodging, you can also choose to pull the thumbstick back towards you, which will result in Jacob blocking the attack. Blocking does result in you taking damage however, and there is also no real way to counter attacks by successfully blocking them until much later on. So with all this knowledge at my disposal, my dopamine deprived sheep brain neurons activated, and I thought to myself, if I can reliably dodge attacks and basically take no damage in combat because of that, then why don't I just upgrade the hell out of the combat stick and go for melee combat whenever I possibly can. And the game's answer to counter this obvious and way too easy strategy is that you'll often meet multiple enemies at once, and on top of that there are enemy types that can spit acidic goo at you. The problem with that is that neither of those two answers really work at all when it came to countering my cheesy melee combat strategy. Because while you do meet groups of enemies quite often, what usually happens when you go in swinging is that the game will automatically kind of target one of the enemies, and you're free to just beat the shit out of him. And I know what you're thinking, but Richard, if I focus on a single enemy while being surrounded by like 2 or 3 more of them, won't they just attack me from behind while I'm being distracted? And actually, you would be totally right if this was any other game. But for some reason, in the Callisto Protocol, enemies act differently. What happens in this game is that the enemies you have your back turned to while you completely obliterate one of their friends will just gently tap you on the shoulder to get your attention. Kind of like a nerdy high school kid that is about to disprove an exaggerated joke you just told with facts and logic.
Excuse me, you're not supposed
to expose your vital spots to me,
human.
It is insane to think that the enemies in the Callisto Protocol, on the hardest difficulty, will basically just gently call your attention by pulling you towards them when they feel like it's their turn to get some one-on-one time, rather than taking advantage of the fact that you're completely exposing yourself to them. And while there are range type enemies that spit at you, more often than not, I found myself surrounded by the normal enemy types, and the spitters actually helped me take those things down rather than making things worse for me. Even the most dangerous type of enemy, which is a more advanced type of mutation that occurs if you don't kill your enemies fast enough after wounding them, basically plays out exactly the same. They charge at you, you dodge, you wait for them to wind down, hit them with your melee weapon until one of their arms break off, and then rinse and repeat until they collapse and you can get your guaranteed loot from them. All in all, I think it's fair to say that enemies on the hardest difficulty in the Callisto Protocol don't feel threatening, they feel tiresome. Because the only thing that does give away that you're in fact playing on the hardest difficulty is that they tank hit after hit after hit after hit. The fact that the only danger enemies in the Callisto Protocol emit is that they're tanky and hit very hard rather than being quick and complex to take down has led to situations where I've often found myself running right towards them with the feeling of might as well get it over with instead of purposely avoiding them. A behavior that I basically never displayed when playing any other survival game. And just in case you're curious about the role that guns play in the hardest difficulty, I personally find them extremely weak and useless due to the aforementioned punching bag nature of the enemies you meet. The basic handgun will need up to 7 shots to take out a standard enemy, and only once you have unlocked the heavy hitter shotgun type of weapons will you see that you're doing actual damage to your enemies. Another gameplay element I just have to mention due to the major role it plays in giving you, the player, an advantage over the enemy is the telekinetic glove, especially in combination with a good chunk of the environment, because wherever you go during your playthrough, you will inevitably always come across spikes that are hanging off the walls, machinery that is rotating at a very fast pace, or will find yourself at elevated places where low handrail is all between you and hundreds of meters of depth. A pretty remarkable moment where you're first introduced to the importance of interaction with the environment happens during chapter 3, and the way it is set up is honestly just so bizarre, because up until that point, the game follows the typical trope to prepare you for an exhaustive battle. Darkness, lots of loot, you being locked in a room without any exit, a switch you have to turn to continue. The developers basically dropped all the clues they could so that you would flex every muscle in your body and prepare for the first battle that would really push you to your limit. And then all the machinery starts spinning. And as if that wasn't enough of a giveaway, the game literally puts 2 batteries for your kinetic glove on the floor and absolutely spells out for you that it wants you to handle the upcoming harder section that is littered with monsters by abusing the absolute hell out of your telekinetic power in combination with the environment. Which you will of course do, given the situation and the overwhelming amount of tanky enemies. After experiencing all this, I think it is fair to say that difficult is the wrong way to describe the Callisto Protocol's maximum security mode with. There's very little demand for any skill, strategy, or resource management, and every hardship you will encounter instead basically just boils down to how patient you are in handling the game's tediosity. There are some other trophies or achievements that need you to pull off a specific combo or have you act a certain way in combat. But they are also effortlessly and naturally done, even on the hardest difficulty, that it is not even really worth mentioning them. Believe me when I tell you that the difficulty will be a very minor obstacle overall if you decide to go for the full completion, save for a few very annoying sections which you will overcome relatively quickly regardless, due to the overall very basic patterns your enemies show and the very generous checkpoints the game triggers every few minutes. While the Callisto Protocol often gets criticized for how short of a game it is, this point of criticism may be one of its few redeeming features when it comes to getting all the achievements done. Because the fact that a single playthrough will take you about 10 hours at most, even if you go in blind on the hardest difficulty, makes the Callisto Protocol a very bearable pain. There aren't any achievements that require a remarkable amount of grinding either, save for one DLC achievement that asks you to beat the game on New Game Plus on the difficulty of your choice. Which I really advise against, because New Game Plus just really doesn't offer anything at all to the experience. There's no new enemies, actual changes to any of the gameplay elements or other such things. And sure, New Game Plus may be the only way you can fully upgrade your weapons, but the differences between a halfway maxed weapon and a fully upgraded one are usually so unspectacular that it just doesn't really matter. If you previously played on the easy or normal difficulty and could blast your enemies apart with your guns, then the same thing would happen on the same difficulty on New Game Plus. And if you had previously played on maximum security difficulty and enemies just absorb bullet after bullet, then you may notice that enemies go down a bit quicker now that you use your fully upgraded weapons on them. But that is pretty much it. Therefore, I would advise you to get everything done in one sole playthrough, as anything that extends beyond that is simply a repetition of the same dull content and highlights the issues of the game even more. The most frustrating thing about the Callisto Protocol in terms of fun and enjoyment is the fact that you can truly and honestly tell that in almost every part of the game there is a relatively solid foundation to be found that was either scarcely built on or just left in its rather raw and basic state. Let's start with something that is immediately apparent and often cited as one of the strongest points of the game: the graphics. The Callisto Protocol is a gorgeous game and the environments you traverse through are no exception, since almost all of them are not only really good looking, but also really do give off the impression as if they are complex and elaborately designed to fit the theme they represent. The prison area, where you start off, is full of long corridors that stretch over multiple floors and levels, and has lots of different paths that first need to be unlocked through bypassing some security measures. Whereas the mining town, an area you go through later, is basically just an assortment of shacks that are constructed in close proximity, sometimes so close that they fuse into each other, which, again, makes sense given the circumstances. Now the problem is that on one hand, the Callisto Protocol offers you such interesting environments that genuinely get you interested and make you want to explore, and at the same time, it is one of the most linear games I have ever played. There is one singular path you have to take at any given time, which will lead you to the next objective. There is no branching out from the path that is laid out for you in any way whatsoever. Even if you do purposely always avoid going down the main route and wander off to explore, you will eventually be met with one of two things. Either a very short hallway that leads to a dead end which rewards your curiosity with a chest that contains some standard loot, which, as I explained before, you already have enough of anyway, or you will come to find that you have just walked in a circle and have not in fact explored a new route, but instead just taken one of two paths that both lead to the same objective and need to be crossed anyway. The Callisto Protocol is basically the very definition of the word linear, and the fact that an image like this one can accurately summarize the majority of its gameplay and environmental structure is really telling. Another element of the game I just have to mention due to how uninspired and dull it seems are the enemies. The Callisto Protocol has 8 different types of enemies, but realistically, you'll only be facing 3 of them on a regular basis. The Grunt, which just come at you swinging and are the exact punching bags and bullet sponges I've described to you earlier. The Blind, which, judging from their behavior, have lost all of their other senses too. And the Big Mouth, which is an enemy type that spits some acid at you every now and then and otherwise acts pretty much exactly like the Grunt. The fact that most of the enemies you meet are as basic as it gets wouldn't even be a major issue if combat and fighting wouldn't be of such high importance in the overall game. Because, realistically, the only thing that adds some meat to the bone between starting a level and walking down the corridor in a straight line until you finish it is that you will have to kill lots of enemies in between. More often than not, they even act as guardians for the item you need to be able to progress to the next area. Meaning that combat is an ever-present and constantly used element in the Callisto Protocol, which you learn to anticipate and accept as an obstacle which you need to overcome first before you can continue on to the next area. That is exactly why it is so much more of a letdown when fighting and combat in general start feeling repetitive and boring even after just the first few hours of the game. To combat this, the developers added in a little gimmick where a parasite emerges out of a chest of a heavily wounded enemy. You now need to shoot that parasite multiple times in a very short time window to stop the mutation from continuing on. This is once again an example of how the raw ideas that were implemented into the game have a lot of potential, but are just never really expanded on or executed well for that matter. Because even if you do let the enemy mutate, nothing happens. The enemy may look a bit weirder now, heals back to full health, and it has some weird meaty blades for hands, but other than that, you're back at square one and just repeat the same exact process until the monster eventually dies for good, which in my case meant dodge, melee, dodge, melee. And let's not forget about the bloodworm enemy type, who is literally just a cheap jump scare followed by button mashing, which may catch you by surprise the first 2 times it happens, but will be thrown at you in such a consistent fashion by the game that you'll eventually just roll your eyes and sigh once it's time to demolish your triangle button again, because another one of those bastards caught on to you. To put it simply, combat is the icing on the cake of mediocrity that is the Callisto Protocol, because it can be described in the same way as basically almost any other gameplay element, hell, even the achievements and trophies. It is not bad, but not very good either. Which to me may actually be more frustrating than just dealing with an outright bad game, because what makes this so painful is that for the first few chapters, the Callisto Protocol is a genuinely fun experience that truly manages to keep you entertained. In those first few hours, where everything is still fresh and not overused yet, where you still have the hope that this is just the beginning of things that will become a lot more complex later on, it is actually a good time. Monsters and the connected fights are still tense and scary, because this is the very beginning and you expect them to get tougher and tougher. The environments are beautiful looking and you're sure that the linearity will eventually open up once you leave the prison area and let you explore a bit more. And even for the story, you have high hopes, because it seems extremely puzzling and confusing, but it should eventually pick up the pace and arrive to a satisfying conclusion. But sadly, none of that ever happens. It feels as if the developers started this game off with lots of ideas and ambition, and then, midway through it, just gave up, which, as a player, makes the last few chapters feel especially unspectacular, because they are the last stretch of a game that ran out of new things it could offer you quite a while ago. As you have probably noticed by now, I've talked very little about achievements and trophies and have been criticizing the game as a whole instead. That is because even when it comes to achievements, the laziness and mediocrity continued, resulting in them offering very little substance or challenge for that matter. Listen to this. I picked up 22 of the 26 achievements on my first blind playthrough, which translates to roughly 85% of them. Wanna know what the last 4 missing trophies were? An unspectacular melee combo I had to use to finish an enemy, finding all the collectibles, finding a secret area, and beating the game on maximum security mode, which, except for the hardest difficulty, required little to no effort at all. I really hope you can forgive me for not talking more about the achievements, because what really was there left to say about them? In all honesty, do yourself a favor and don't even think about going for that one silly trophy or achievement that asks you to do yet another playthrough on New Game Plus, because you are truly not missing anything by not playing it. The Callisto Protocol is one of those games where I really feel like the reviews do it justice. It is decent enough, works well, and isn't overly painful to complete. And as I've just explained, it's honestly kind of the same when it comes to the achievements. None of them are particularly difficult or time consuming and shouldn't bother you too much at any given time. If you want me to be absolutely honest with you, I think that even for your first playthrough, you should open up a guide right away so that you can stack all of the collectibles in one go and won't miss any of them. As there is no chapter select option and a single missed collectible will mean starting the game over from scratch or the last manual save you made. From the beginning, try to keep an eye on the miscellaneous achievements as well and get them out of the way. Because besides very few exceptions, you will pick most of them up naturally anyway. To summarize, try to do anything in your power to make the full completion for this game as short as possible, and you might even come out of the experience while still liking the game. If you do what I did, which is a blind playthrough on normal, another playthrough on maximum security, and then one last playthrough on New Game Plus, you will definitely have run out of patience and feel overly frustrated with what might be an okay game after all. Therefore, my conclusion is, go for that platinum, but screw the 100% completion. So friends, we've once again made it to the end of the video. What do you think? Do you agree with my opinion at all? What is the trophy or achievement you personally struggled the most with? Whatever is on your mind, feel free to let me know about it in the comments, as I really value your feedback and check out every single thing you write. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a subscription. If you have any game in mind which I should cover next in this series, please let me know about that as well. Lastly, feel free to check out the playlist right here where we look at different video game franchises and their respective rarest achievements. Most importantly, and as always though, thank you so much for spending your precious time by watching my content. It means the world to me. See you in the next video, friends, and be well.